Section 21. Hermeneutical discussion of the Cartesian ontology of the world. The critical question now arises: does this ontology of the world seek the phenomenon of the world at all? And if not, does it at least define some entity within the world fully enough so that the worldly character of this entity can be made visible in it? To both questions we must answer no. The entity which Descartes is trying to grasp ontologically and in principle with his extensio is rather such as to become discoverable first of all by going through an entity within the world which is proximally ready to hand, nature. Though this is the case, and though any ontological characterization of this latter entity within the world may lead us into obscurity, even if we consider both the idea of substantiality and the meaning of the existit, it exists, and ad existendum, towards existing, which have been brought into the definition of that idea, it still remains possible that through an ontology based upon a radical separation of God, the I, and the world, the ontological problem of the world will in some sense get formulated and further advanced. If, however, this is not possible, we must then demonstrate explicitly not only that Descartes' conception of the world is ontologically defective, but that his interpretation and the foundations on which it is based have led him to pass over both the phenomenon of the world and the being of those entities within the world which are proximally ready to hand. In our exposition of the problem of worldhood, we suggested the importance of obtaining proper access to this phenomenon. So, in criticizing the Cartesian point of departure, we must ask which kind of being that belongs to Dasein we should fix upon as giving us an appropriate way of access to those entities with whose being as extensio Descartes equates the being of the world. The only genuine access to them lies in knowing, erkennen, intellectio, in the sense of the kind of knowledge, erkenntnis, which we get in mathematics and physics. Mathematical knowledge is regarded by Descartes as the one manner of apprehending entities which can always give assurance that their being has been securely grasped. If anything measures up in its own kind of being to the being that is accessible in mathematical knowledge, then it is in the authentic sense. Such entities are those which always are what they are. Accordingly, that which can be shown to have the character of something that constantly remains, as remanens capex mutationem, a thing remaining, capable of changes, makes up the real being of those entities of the world which get experienced. That which enduringly remains really is. This is the sort of thing which mathematics knows. That which is accessible in an entity through mathematics makes up its being. Thus the being of the world is, as it were, dictated to it in terms of a definite idea of being which lies veiled in the concept of substantiality, and in the terms of the idea of a knowledge by which such entities are cognized. The kind of being which belongs to entities within the world is something which they themselves might have been permitted to present. But Descartes does not let them do so. Instead, he prescribes for the world its real being, as it were, on the basis of an idea of being whose source has not been unveiled, and which has not been demonstrated in its own right. An idea in which being is equated with constant presence at hand. Thus his ontology of the world is not primarily determined by his leaning towards mathematics, a science which he chances to esteem very highly, but rather by his ontological orientation in principle towards being as constant presence at hand, which mathematical knowledge is exceptionally well suited to grasp. In this way Descartes explicitly switches over philosophically from the development of traditional ontology to modern mathematical physics and its transcendental foundations. The problem of how to get appropriate access to entities within the world is one which Descartes feels no need to raise. Under the unbroken ascendance of the traditional ontology, the way to get a genuine grasp of what really is, des eigentlichen Seienden, has been decided in advance. It lies in Noein, beholding in the widest sense, der Anschauung im weitesten Sinne. Dianoein, or thinking, is just a more fully achieved form of noein, and is founded upon it. Sensatio, sensation, as opposed to intellectio, understanding still remains possible as a way of access to entities by a beholding which is perceptual in character. But Descartes presents his critique of it because he is oriented ontologically by these principles. Descartes knows very well that entities do not proximally show themselves in their real being. What is proximally given is this waxen thing which is coloured, flavoured, hard, and cold in definite ways, and which gives off its own special sound when struck. But this is not of any importance ontologically, nor in general is anything which is given through the senses. Descartes says, "It will be enough if we point out that the perceptions of the senses are not preferred to anything but the union of the human body with the mind, and that indeed they ordinarily show us in what way external bodies can be of help to it or do it harm." But Descartes says, they do not teach us what kinds of things, bodies, exist in themselves. If we do this, we shall perceive that the nature of matter or of body, as regarded universally, does not consist in its being something hard, or heavy, or coloured, or affecting the senses in some other way, but only in its being something extended in length, breadth, and thickness. If we subject Descartes' interpretation of the experience of hardness and resistance to a critical analysis, it will be plain how unable he is to let what shows itself in sensation present itself in its own kind of being, or even to determine its character. Hardness gets taken as resistance, but neither hardness nor resistance is understood in a phenomenal sense, as something experienced in itself whose nature can be determined in such an experience. For Descartes, resistance amounts to no more than not yielding place, that is, not undergoing any change of location. So if a thing resists, this means that it stays in a definite location relatively to some other thing which is changing its location, or that it is changing its own location with a velocity which permits the other thing to catch up with it. But when the experience of hardness is interpreted this way, the kind of being which belongs to sensory perception is obliterated, and so is any possibility that the entities encountered in such perception should be grasped in their being. Descartes takes the kind of being which belongs to the perception of something and translates it into the only kind he knows. The perception of something becomes a definite way of being present at hand side by side of two res extensi, extended things, which are present at hand. The way in which their movements are related is itself a mode of that extensio, extension, by which the presence at hand of the corporeal thing is primarily characterized. Of course, no behavior in which one feels one's way by touch, eines tastenden Verhaltens, can be completed unless what can thus be felt, das Betastbaren, has closeness of a very special kind. But this does not mean that touching, Berührung, and the hardness which makes itself known in touching consist ontologically in different velocities of two corporeal things. Hardness and resistance do not show themselves at all unless an entity has the kind of being which Dasein, or at least something living, possesses. Thus, Descartes' discussion of possible kinds of access to entities within the world is dominated by an idea of being which has been gathered from a definite realm of these entities themselves. The idea of being as permanent presence at hand not only gives Descartes a motive for identifying entities within the world with the world in general, and for providing so extreme a definition of their being, it also keeps him from bringing Dasein's ways of behaving into view in a manner which is ontologically appropriate. But thus the road is completely blocked to seeing the founded character of all sensory and intellective awareness, and to understanding these as possibilities of being in the world. On the contrary, he takes the being of Dasein, to whose basic constitution being in the world belongs, in the very same way as he takes the being of the res extensa, a thing which is extended, namely as substance. But with these criticisms have we not fobbed off on Descartes a task altogether beyond his horizon, and then gone on to demonstrate that he has failed to solve it? If Descartes does not know the phenomenon of the world, and thus knows no such thing as within-the-worldness, how can he identify the world itself with certain entities within the world and the being which they possess? In controversy over principles, one must not only attach oneself to theses which can be grasped doxographically. One must also derive one's orientation from the objective tendency of the problematic, even if it does not go beyond a rather ordinary way of taking things. In his doctrine of the res cogitans and the res extensa, Descartes not only wants to formulate the problem of the I and the world, he claims to have solved it in a radical manner. His Méditations make this plain. See especially Méditations 1 and 6. By taking his basic ontological orientation from traditional sources, and not subjecting it to positive criticism, he has made it impossible to lay bare any primordial ontological problematic of Dasein. This has inevitably obstructed his view of the phenomenon of the world, and has made it possible for the ontology of the world to be compressed into that of certain entities within the world. The foregoing discussion should have proved this. One might retort, however, that even if, in point of fact, both the problem of the world and the being of the entities encountered environmentally as closest to us remain concealed, Descartes has still laid the basis for characterizing ontologically that entity within the world upon which, in its very being, every other entity is founded, material nature. This would be the fundamental stratum upon which all the other strata of actuality within the world are built up. The extended thing, as such, would serve, in the first instance, as the ground for those definite characters which show themselves, to be sure, as qualities, but which at bottom are quantitative modifications of the modes of the extensio itself. These qualities, which are themselves reducible, would provide the footing for such specific qualities as beautiful, ugly, in keeping, not in keeping, useful, useless. If one is oriented primarily by thinghood, these latter qualities must be taken as non-quantifiable value predicates, by which what is in the first instance just a material thing gets stamped as something good. But with this stratification we come to those entities which we have characterized ontologically as equipment ready to hand. The Cartesian analysis of the world would thus enable us for the first time to build up securely the structure of what is proximally ready to hand. All it takes is to round out the thing of nature until it becomes a full-fledged thing of use, and this is easily done. But quite apart from the specific problem of the world itself, can the being of what we encounter proximally within the world be reached ontologically by this procedure? When we speak of material thinghood, have we not tacitly posited a kind of being, the constant presence at hand of things, which is so far from having been rounded out ontologically by subsequently endowing entities with value predicates, that these value characters themselves are rather just ontical characteristics of those entities which have the kind of being possessed by things. Adding on, value predicates cannot tell us anything at all new about the being of goods, but would merely presuppose again that goods have pure presence at hand as their kind of being. Values would then be determinate characteristics which a thing possesses, and they would be present at hand. They would have their sole ultimate ontological source in our previously laying down the actuality of things as the fundamental stratum. But even pre-phenomenological experience shows that in an entity which is supposedly a thing, there is something that will not become fully intelligible through thinghood alone. Thus the being of things has to be rounded out. What, then, does the being of values, or their validity, Geltung, which Lotze took as a mode of affirmation, really amount to ontologically? And what does it signify ontologically for things to be invested with values in this way? As long as these matters remain obscure, to reconstruct the thing of use in terms of the thing of nature is an ontologically questionable undertaking, even if one disregards the way in which the problematic has been perverted in principle. And if we are to reconstruct this thing of use, which supposedly comes to us in the first instance, with its skin off, does not this always require that we previously take a positive look at the phenomenon whose totality such a reconstruction is to restore? But if we have not given a proper explanation beforehand of its ownmost state of being, are we not building our reconstruction without a plan, inasmuch as this reconstruction and rounding out of the traditional ontology of the world results in our reaching the same entities with which we started when we analyzed the readiness to hand of equipment and the totality of involvements? It seems as if the being of these entities has in fact been clarified, or has at least become a problem. But by taking extensio as a proprietas, Descartes can hardly reach the being of substance, and by taking refuge in value characteristics, wertlichen Beschaffenheiten, we are just as far from even catching a glimpse of being as readiness to hand, let alone permitting it to become an ontological theme. Descartes has narrowed down the question of the world to that of things of nature, Naturdinglichkeit, as those entities within the world which are proximally accessible. He has confirmed the opinion that to know an entity in what is supposedly the most rigorous ontical manner is our only possible access to the primary being of the entity which such knowledge reveals. But at the same time, we must have the insight to see that in principle the roundings out of the thing ontology also operate on the same dogmatic basis as that which Descartes has adopted. We have already intimated in section 14 that passing over the world and those entities which we proximally encounter is not accidental, not an oversight which it would be simple to correct, but that it is grounded in a kind of being which belongs essentially to Dasein itself. When our analytic of Dasein has given some transparency to those main structures of Dasein, which are of the most importance in the framework of this problematic, and when we have assigned, zugewiesen, to the concept of being in general, the horizon within which its intelligibility becomes possible, so that readiness to hand and presence at hand also become primordially intelligible ontologically for the first time, only then can our critique of the Cartesian ontology of the world, an ontology which in principle is still the usual one today, come philosophically into its own. To do this, we must show several things. See Part 1, Division 3. 1. Why was the phenomenon of the world passed over at the beginning of the ontological tradition which has been decisive for us, explicitly in the case of Parmenides, and why has this passing over kept constantly recurring? 2. Why is it that instead of the phenomenon thus passed over, entities within the world have intervened as an ontological theme? 3. Why are these entities found in the first instance in nature? 4. Why has recourse been taken to the phenomenon of value when it has seemed necessary to round out such an ontology of the world? In the answers to these questions, a positive understanding of the problematic of the world will be reached for the first time. The sources of our failure to recognize it will be exhibited, and the ground for rejecting the traditional ontology of the world will have been demonstrated. The world and Dasein and entities within the world are the ontologically constitutive states which are closest to us. But we have no guarantee that we can achieve the basis for meeting up with these as phenomena by the seemingly obvious procedure of starting with the things of the world, still less by taking our orientation from what is supposedly the most rigorous knowledge of entities. Our observations on Descartes should have brought us this insight. But if we recall that spatiality is manifestly one of the constituents of entities within the world, then in the end the Cartesian analysis of the world can still be rescued. When Descartes was so radical as to set up the extension as the presuppositum for every definite characteristic of the res corporea, a thing which has body, he prepared the way for the understanding of something a priori, whose content Kant was to establish with greater penetration. Within certain limits, the analysis of the extensio remains independent of his neglecting to provide an explicit interpretation for the being of extended entities. There is some phenomenal justification for regarding the extensio as a basic characteristic of the world, even if by recourse to this neither the spatiality of the world nor that of entities we encounter in our environment, a spatiality which is proximally discovered, nor even that of Dasein itself, can be conceived ontologically. C. The aroundness of the environment and Daseinsspatiality. In connection with our first preliminary sketch of being in, we had to contrast Dasein with the way of being in space which we call insideness, Inwendigkeit. This expression means that an entity which is itself extended is closed round, umschlossen, by the extended boundaries of something that is likewise extended. The entity inside, das inwendig Seiende, and that which closes it round, are both present at hand in space. Yet even if we deny that Dasein has any such insideness in a spatial receptacle, this does not in principle exclude it from having any spatiality at all, but merely keeps open the way for seeing the kind of spatiality which is constitutive for Dasein. This must now be set forth. But inasmuch as any entity within the world is likewise in space, its spatiality will have an ontological connection with the world. We must therefore determine in what sense space is a constituent for that world which has in turn been characterized as an item in the structure of being in the world. In particular, we must show how the aroundness of the environment, the specific spatiality of entities encountered in the environment, is founded upon the worldhood of the world, while contrariwise the world, on its part, is not present at hand in space. Our study of Dasein's spatiality and the way in which the world is spatially determined will take its departure from an analysis of what is ready to hand in space within the world. We shall consider three topics. 1. The spatiality of the ready-to-hand within the world. 2. The spatiality of being in the world. 3. Space and the spatiality of Dasein. 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 Section 22. The spatiality of the ready-to-hand within the world. If space is constitutive for the world in a sense which we have yet to determine, then it cannot surprise us that in our foregoing ontological characterization of the being of what is within the world, we have had to look upon this as something that is also within space. This spatiality of the ready-to-hand is something which we have not yet grasped explicitly as a phenomenon, nor have we pointed out how it is bound up with the structure of being which belongs to the ready-to-hand. This is now our task. To what extent has our characterization of the ready-to-hand already come up against its spatiality? We have not been talking about what is proximally ready-to-hand. This means not only those entities which we encounter first, before any others, but also those which are close by. What is ready-to-hand in our everyday dealings has the character of closeness. To be exact, this closeness of equipment has already been intimated in the term readiness to hand, which expresses the being of equipment. Every entity that is to hand has a different closeness, which is not to be ascertained by measuring distances. This closeness regulates itself in terms of circumspectively calculative, manipulating, and using. At the same time, what is close in this way gets established by the circumspection of concern, with regard to the direction in which the equipment is accessible at any time. When this closeness of the equipment has been given directionality, this signifies not merely that the equipment has its position, Stelle, in space as present at hand somewhere, but also that as equipment it has been essentially fitted up and installed, set up and put to rights. Equipment has its place, Platz, or else it lies around. This must be distinguished in principle from just occurring at random in some spatial position. When equipment for something or other has its place, this place defines itself as the place of this equipment, as one place out of a whole totality of places directionally lined up with each other, and belonging to the context of equipment that is environmentally ready to hand. Such a place and such a multiplicity of places are not to be interpreted as the where of some random being present at hand of things. In each case the place is the definitive there, or yonder, dort und da, of an item of equipment which belongs somewhere. Its belonging somewhere at the time, die jeweilige Hingehörigkeit, corresponds to the equipmental character of what is ready to hand. That is, it corresponds to the belonging to, Zugehörigkeit, which the ready-to-hand has towards a totality of equipment in accordance with its involvements. But in general, the whither to which the totality of places for a context of equipment gets allotted is the underlying condition which makes possible the belonging somewhere of an equipmental totality as something that can be placed. This whither, which makes it possible for equipment to belong somewhere, and which we circumspectively keep in view ahead of us in our concernful dealings, we call the region. In the region of means not only in the direction of, but also within the range, Umkreis, of something that lies in that direction. The kind of place which is constituted by direction and remoteness, and closeness is only a mode of the latter, is already oriented towards a region and oriented within it. Something like a region must first be discovered, if there is to be any possibility of allotting, or coming across, places for a totality of equipment that is circumspectively at one's disposal. The regional orientation of the multiplicity of places belonging to the ready-to-hand goes to make up the aroundness, the roundaboutus, das uns herum, of those entities which we encounter as closest environmentally. A three-dimensional multiplicity of possible positions which gets filled up with things present at hand is never proximally given. This dimensionality of space is still veiled in the spatiality of the ready-to-hand. The above is what is on the ceiling, the below is what is on the floor, the behind is what is at the door. All wheres are discovered and circumspectively interpreted as we go our ways in everyday dealings. They are not ascertained and catalogued by the observational measurement of space. Regions are not first formed by things which are present at hand together. They always are ready to hand already in individual places. Places themselves either get allotted to the ready to hand in the circumspection of concern, or we come across them. Thus anything constantly ready to hand, of which circumspective being in the world takes account beforehand, has its place. The where of its readiness to hand is put to account as a matter for concern, and oriented towards the rest of what is ready to hand. Thus the sun, whose light and warmth are in everyday use, has its own places: sunrise, midday, sunset, midnight. These are discovered in circumspection, and treated distinctively in terms of changes in the usability of what the sun bestows. Here we have something which is ready to hand with uniform constancy, although it keeps changing. Its places become accentuated indicators of the regions which lie in them. These celestial regions, which need not have any geographical meaning as yet, provide the whither beforehand for every special way of giving form to the regions, which places can occupy. The house has its sunny side and its shady side. The way it is divided up into rooms, Räume, is oriented towards these, and so is the arrangement, Einrichtung, within them, according to their character as equipment. Churches and graves, for instance, are laid out according to the rising and the setting of the sun, the regions of life and death, which are determinative for Dasein itself, with regard to its ownmost possibilities of being in the world. Dasein, in its very being, has this being as an issue, and its concern discovers beforehand those regions in which some involvement is decisive. This discovery of regions beforehand is co-determined, mitbestimmt, by the totality of involvements, for which the ready-to-hand, as something encountered, is freed. The readiness to hand, which belongs to any such region beforehand, has the character of inconspicuous familiarity, and it has it in an even more primordial sense than does the being of the ready-to-hand. The region itself becomes visible in a conspicuous manner only when one discovers the ready-to-hand circumspectively, and does so in the deficient modes of concern. Often the region of a place does not become accessible explicitly as such a region until one fails to find something in its place. The space which is discovered in circumspective being in the world, as the spatiality of the totality of equipment, always belongs to entities themselves as the place of that totality. The bare space itself is still veiled over. Space has been split up into places, but this spatiality has its own unity through that totality of involvements in accordance with the world, Weltmäßige, which belongs to the spatially ready to hand. The environment does not arrange itself in a space which has been given in advance, but its specific worldhood, in its significance, articulates the context of involvements which belongs to some current totality of circumspectively allotted places. The world at such a time always reveals the spatiality of the space which belongs to it. To encounter the ready-to-hand in its environmental space remains ontically possible only because Dasein itself is spatial with regard to its being in the world. Section 23. The spatiality of being in the world. If we attribute spatiality to Dasein, then this being in space must manifestly be conceived in terms of the kind of being which that entity possesses. Dasein is essentially not a being present at hand, and its spatiality cannot signify anything like occurrence at a position in world space. Nor can it signify being ready to hand at some place. Both of these are kinds of being which belong to entities encountered within the world. Dasein, however, is in the world in the sense that it deals with entities encountered within the world, and does so concernfully and with familiarity. So if spatiality belongs to it in any way, that is possible only because of this being in. But its spatiality shows the characters of disseverance and directionality. When we speak of disseverance as a kind of being which Dasein has with regard to its being in the world, we do not understand it by any such thing as remoteness or closeness or even a distance. We use the expression disseverance in a signification which is both active and transitive. It stands for a constitutive state of Dasein's being, a state with regard to which removing something in the sense of putting it away is only a determinate, factical mode. Dissevering amounts to making the farness vanish, that is, making the remoteness of something disappear, bringing it close. Dasein is essentially disseverant. It lets any entity be encountered close by as the entity which it is. Disseverance discovers remoteness, and remoteness, like distance, is a determinate categorical characteristic of entities whose nature is not that of Dasein. Disseverance, however, is an existentiale. This must be kept in mind. Only to the extent that entities are revealed for Dasein in their disseveredness, Entferntheit, do remotenesses, Entfernungen, and distances with regard to other things become accessible in entities within the world themselves. Two points are just as little dissevered from one another as two things, for neither of these types of entity has the kind of being which would make it capable of dissevering. They merely have a measurable distance between them, which we can come across in our dissevering. Proximally, and for the most part, dissevering is a circumspective bringing close, bringing something close by in the sense of procuring it, putting it in readiness, having it to hand. But certain ways in which entities are discovered in a purely cognitive manner also have the character of bringing them close. In Dasein there lies an essential tendency towards closeness. All the ways in which we speed things up, as we are more or less compelled to do today, push us on towards the conquest of remoteness. With the radio, for example, Dasein has so expanded its everyday environment that it has accomplished a disseverance of the world, a disseverance which, in its meaning for Dasein, cannot yet be visualized. Dissevering does not necessarily imply any explicit estimation of the farness of something ready to hand in relation to Dasein. Above all, remoteness never gets taken as a distance. If farness is to be estimated, this is done relatively to disseverances in which everyday Dasein maintains itself. though these estimates may be imprecise and variable if we try to compute them, in the everydayness of Dasein they have their own definiteness, which is thoroughly intelligible. We say that to go over yonder is a good walk, a stone's throw, or as long as it takes to smoke a pipe. These measures express not only that they are not intended to measure anything, but also that the remoteness here estimated belongs to some entity to which one goes with concernful circumspection. But even when we avail ourselves of a fixed measure and say it is half an hour to the house, this measure must be taken as an estimate. Half an hour is not 30 minutes, but a duration, Dauer, which has no length at all in the sense of a quantitative stretch. Such a duration is always interpreted in terms of well-accustomed everyday ways in which we make provision, Besorgungen. Remotenesses are estimated proximally by circumspection, even when one is quite familiar with officially calculated measures. Since what is dissevered in such estimates is ready to hand, it retains its character as specifically within the world. This even implies that the pathways we take towards dissevered entities in the course of our dealings will vary in their length from day to day. What is ready to hand in the environment is certainly not present at hand for an eternal observer exempt from Dasein. But it is encountered in Dasein's circumspectively concernful everydayness. As Dasein goes along its ways, it does not measure off a stretch of space as a corporeal thing which is present at hand. It does not devour the kilometers. Bringing close, or disseverance, is always a kind of concernful being towards what is brought close and dissevered. A pathway which is long, objectively, can be much shorter than one which is objectively shorter still, but which is perhaps hard-going, and comes before us as interminably long. Yet only in this coming before us is the current world authentically ready to hand. The objective distances of things present at hand do not coincide with the remoteness and closeness of what is ready to hand within the world. Though we may know these distances exactly, this knowledge still remains blind. It does not have the function of discovering the environment circumspectively and bringing it close. This knowledge is used only in and for a concernful being which does not measure stretches, a being towards the world that matters to one. Sein zu der einen angehenden Welt. When one is orientated beforehand towards nature and objectively measured distances of things, one is inclined to pass off such estimates and interpretations of disseverance as subjective. Yet this subjectivity perhaps uncovers the reality of the world at its most real. It has nothing to do with subjective arbitrariness or subjectivistic ways of taking an entity which in itself is otherwise. The circumspective dissevering of Dasein's everydayness reveals the being in itself of the true world, of that entity which Dasein, as something existing, is already alongside. When one is primarily and even exclusively oriented towards remotenesses as measured distances, the primordial spatiality of being in is concealed. That which is presumably closest is by no means that which is at the smallest distance from us. It lies in that which is dissevered to an average extent when we reach for it, grasp it, or look at it. Because Dasein is essentially spatial in the way of disseverance, its dealings always keep within an environment which is dissevered from it with a certain leeway, Spielraum. Accordingly, our seeing and hearing always go proximally beyond what is distantially closest. Seeing and hearing are distance senses, Fernsinne, not because they are far-reaching, but because it is in them that Dasein, as disseverant, mainly dwells. When, for instance, a man wears a pair of spectacles which are so close to him distantially that they are sitting on his nose, they are environmentally more remote from him than the picture on the opposite wall. Such equipment has so little closeness that often it is proximally quite impossible to find. Equipment for seeing, and likewise for hearing, such as the telephone receiver, has what we have designated as the inconspicuousness of the proximally ready to hand. So too, for instance, does the street, as equipment for walking. One feels the touch of it at every step as one walks. It is seemingly the closest and realest of all that is ready to hand, and it slides itself, as it were, along certain portions of one's body, the soles of one's feet. And yet it is farther remote from the acquaintance whom one encounters on the street at a remoteness, Entfernung, of 20 paces when one is taking such a walk. Circumspective concern decides as to the closeness and farness of what is proximally ready to hand environmentally. Whatever this concern dwells alongside beforehand is what is closest, and this is what regulates our disseverances. If Dasein in its concern brings something close by, this does not signify that it fixes something at a spatial position with a minimal distance from some point of the body. When something is close by, this means that it is within the range of what is proximally ready to hand for circumspection. Bringing close is not oriented towards the I thing encumbered with a body, but towards concernful being in the world, that is, towards whatever is proximally encountered in such being. It follows, moreover, that Dasein's spatiality is not to be defined by citing the position at which some corporeal thing is present at hand. Of course, we may say that even Dasein always occupies a place, but this occupying must be distinguished in principle from being ready to hand at a place in some particular region. Occupying a place must be conceived as a dissevering of the environmentally ready to hand into a region which has been circumspectively discovered in advance. Dasein understands its here in terms of its environmental yonder. The here does not mean the where of something present at hand, but rather the whereat, wobei, of a disseverant being alongside, together with this disseverance. Dasein, in accordance with its spatiality, is proximally never here, but yonder. From this yonder it comes back to its here, and it comes back to its here only in the way in which it interprets its concernful being towards in terms of what is ready to hand yonder. This becomes quite plain if we consider a certain phenomenal peculiarity of the disseverance structure of being in. As being in the world, Dasein maintains itself essentially in a dissevering. This disseverance, the farness of the ready-to-hand from Dasein itself, is something that Dasein can never cross over. Of course, the remoteness of something ready-to-hand from Dasein can show up as a distance from it, if this remoteness is determined by a relation to some thing which gets thought of as present at hand at the place Dasein has formerly occupied. Dasein can subsequently traverse the between of this distance, but only in such a way that the distance itself becomes one which has been dissevered. So little has Dasein crossed over its disseverance that it has rather taken it along with it, and keeps doing so constantly. For Dasein is essentially disseverance, that is, it is spatial. It cannot wander about within the current range of its disseverances. It can never do more than change them. Dasein is spatial in that it discovers space circumspectively, so that indeed it constantly comports itself disseverantly towards the entities thus spatially encountered. As disseverant being in, Dasein has likewise the character of directionality. Every bringing close, Näherung, has already taken in advance a direction towards a region out of which what is dissevered brings itself close, sich nähert, so that one can come across it with regard to its place. Circumspective concern is dissevering which gives directionality. In this concern, that is, in the being in the world of Dasein itself, a supply of signs is presented. Signs as equipment take over the giving of directions in a way which is explicit and easily manipulable. They keep explicitly open those regions which have been used circumspectively, the particular whithers to which something belongs or goes, or gets brought or fetched. If Dasein is, it already has, as directing and dissevering its own discovered region. Both directionality and disseverance, as modes of being in the world, are guided beforehand by the circumspection of concern. Out of this directionality arise the fixed directions of right and left. Dasein constantly takes these directions along with it, just as it does its disseverances. Dasein's spatialization in its bodily nature is likewise marked out in accordance with these directions. This bodily nature hides a whole problematic of its own, though we shall not treat it here. Thus things which are ready to hand and used for the body, like gloves, for example, which are to move with the hands, must be given directionality towards right and left. A craftsman's tools, however, which are held in the hand and are moved with it, do not share the hand's specifically manual, handliche movements. So, although hammers are handled just as much with the hand as gloves are, there are no right or left-handed hammers. One must notice, however, that the directionality which belongs to disseverance is founded upon being in the world. Left and right are not something subjective for which the subject has a feeling. They are directions of one's directedness into a world that is ready to hand already. By the mere feeling of a difference between my two sides, I could never find my way about in a world. The subject, with a mere feeling of this difference, is a construct posited in disregard of the state that is truly constitutive for any subject, namely, that whenever Dasein has such a mere feeling, it is in a world already, and must be in it to be able to orient itself at all. This becomes plain from the example with which Kant tries to clarify the phenomenon of orientation. Suppose I step into a room which is familiar to me, but dark, and which has been rearranged, umgeräumt, during my absence, so that everything which used to be at my right is now at my left. If I am to orient myself, the mere feeling of the difference between my two sides will be of no help at all, as long as I fail to apprehend some definite object whose position, as Kant remarks casually, I have in mind. But what does this signify, except that whenever this happens, I necessarily orient myself both in and from my being already alongside a world which is familiar? The equipment context of a world must have been presented to Dasein. That I am already in a world is no less constitutive for the possibility of orientation than is the feeling for right and left. While this state of Dasein's being is an obvious one, we are not thereby justified in suppressing the ontologically constitutive role which it plays. Even Kant does not suppress it, any more than any other interpretation of Dasein. Yet the fact that this is a state of which we constantly make use does not exempt us from providing a suitable ontological explication, but rather demands one. The psychological interpretation according to which the I has something in the memory, im Gedächtnis, is at bottom a way of alluding to the existentially constitutive state of being in the world. Since Kant fails to see this structure, he also fails to recognize all the interconnections which the constitution of any possible orientation implies. Directedness with regard to right and left is based upon the essential directionality of Dasein in general, and this directionality in turn is essentially co-determined by being in the world. Even Kant, of course, has not taken orientation as a theme for interpretation. He merely wants to show that every orientation requires a subjective principle. Here subjective is meant to signify that this principle is a priori. Nevertheless, the a priori character of directedness with regard to right and left is based upon the subjective a priori of being in the world, which has nothing to do with any determinate character restricted beforehand to a worldless subject. Disseverance and directionality, as constitutive characteristics of being in, are determinative for Dasein's spatiality, for its being concernfully and circumspectively in space, in a space discovered and within the world. Only the explication we have just given for the spatiality of the ready-to-hand within the world, and the spatiality of being in the world, will provide the prerequisites for working out the phenomenon of the world's spatiality and formulating the ontological problem of space. of space. Of space. Section 24. Space and Dasein's spatiality. As being in the world, Dasein has already discovered a world at any time. This discovery, which is founded upon the worldhood of the world, is one which we have characterized as freeing entities for a totality of involvements. Freeing something and letting it be involved is accomplished by way of referring or assigning oneself circumspectively, and this in turn is based upon one's previously understanding significance. We have now shown that circumspective being in the world is spatial, and only because Dasein is spatial in the way of disseverance and directionality can what is ready to hand within the world be encountered in its spatiality. To free a totality of involvement is, equiprimordially, to let something be involved at a region, and to do so by dissevering and giving directionality. This amounts to freeing the spatial belonging somewhere of the ready-to-hand. In that significance with which Dasein, as concernful being in, is familiar, lies the essential co-disclosedness of space. The space which is thus disclosed, with the worldhood of the world, still lacks the pure multiplicity of the three dimensions. In this disclosedness which is closest to us, space, as the pure wherein, in which positions are ordered by measurement, and the situations of things are determined, still remains hidden. In the phenomenon of the region, we have already indicated that, on the basis of which space is discovered beforehand in Dasein. By a region we have understood the whither to which an equipment context, ready to hand, might possibly belong, when that context is of such a sort that it can be encountered as directionally dissevered, that is, as having been placed. This belongingness, Gehörigkeit, is determined in terms of the significance which is constitutive for the world, and it articulates the hither and thither within the possible whither. In general, the whither gets prescribed by a referential totality which has been made fast in a for the sake of which of concern, and within which letting something be involved by freeing it assigns itself. With anything encountered as ready to hand, there is always an involvement in, by, a region. To the totality of involvements which makes up the being of the ready to hand within the world, there belongs a spatial involvement which has the character of a region. By reason of such an involvement, the ready-to-hand becomes something which we can come across and ascertain as having form and direction. With the factical being of Dasein, what is ready to hand within the world is dissevered, and given directionality, depending upon the degree of transparency that is possible for concernful circumspection. When we let entities within the world be encountered in the way which is constitutive for being in the world, we give them space. This giving space, which we also call making room for them, consists in freeing the ready-to-hand for its spatiality. As a way of discovering and presenting a possible totality of spaces determined by involvements, this making room is what makes possible one's factical orientation at the time. In concerning itself circumspectively with the world, Dasein can move things around or out of the way or make room for them, Weg und einräumen, only because making room, understood as an existentiale, belongs to its being in the world. But neither the region previously discovered, nor in general the current spatiality, is explicitly in view. In itself it is present, zugegen, for circumspection in the inconspicuousness of those ready-to-hand things in which that circumspection is concernfully absorbed. With being in the world, space is proximally discovered in this spatiality. On the basis of the spatiality thus discovered, space itself becomes accessible for cognition. Space is not in the subject, nor is the world in space. Space is rather in the world, insofar as space has been disclosed by that being in the world which is constitutive for Dasein. Space is not to be found in the subject, nor does the subject observe the world as if that world were in a space. But the subject, Dasein, if well understood ontologically, is spatial. And because Dasein is spatial in the way that we have described, space shows itself as a priori. This term does not mean anything like previously belonging to a subject, which is proximally still worldless and which emits a space out of itself. Here, a priority means the previousness with which space has been encountered as a region whenever the ready-to-hand is encountered environmentally. The spatiality of what we proximally encounter in circumspection can become a theme for circumspection itself, as well as a task for calculation and measurement, as in building and surveying. Such thematization of the spatiality of the environment is still predominantly an act of circumspection, by which space in itself already comes into view in a certain way. The space which thus shows itself can be studied purely by looking at it, if one gives up what was formerly the only possibility of access to it, circumspective calculation. When space is intuited formally, the pure possibilities of spatial relations are discovered. Here one may go through a series of stages in laying bare pure homogeneous space, passing from the pure morphology of spatial shapes to analysis cetus, and finally to the purely metrical science of space. In our present study, we shall not consider how all these are interconnected. Our problematic is merely designed to establish ontologically the phenomenal basis upon which one can take the discovery of pure space as a theme for investigation and work it out. When space is discovered non-circumspectively by just looking at it, the environmental regions get neutralized to pure dimensions. Places, and indeed the whole circumspectively oriented totality of places belonging to equipment ready to hand, get reduced to a multiplicity of positions for random things. The spatiality of what is ready to hand within the world loses its involvement character, and so does the ready to hand. The world loses its specific aroundness. The environment becomes the world of nature. The world, as a totality of equipment ready to hand, becomes spatialized, verräumlicht, to a context of extended things which are just present at hand and no more. The homogeneous space of nature shows itself only when the entities we encounter are discovered in such a way that the worldly character of the ready-to-hand gets specifically deprived of its worldhood. In accordance with its being in the world, Dasein always has space presented as already discovered, though not thematically. On the other hand, space in itself, so far as it embraces the mere possibilities of the pure spatial being of something, remains proximally still concealed. The fact that space essentially shows itself in a world is not yet decisive for the kind of being which it possesses. It need not have the kind of being characteristic of something which is itself spatially ready to hand or present at hand. Nor does the being of space have the kind of being which belongs to Dasein, though the being of space itself cannot be conceived as the kind of being which belongs to a res extensa, extended thing. It does not follow that it must be defined ontologically as a phenomenon of such a res thing. In its being, it would not be distinguished from such a res, nor does it follow that the being of space can be equated to that of the res cogitans, a thing which thinks, and conceived as merely subjective, quite apart from the questionable character of the being of such a subject. The interpretation of the being of space has hitherto been a matter of perplexity, not so much because we have been insufficiently acquainted with the content of space itself, as a thing, des Sachgehaltes des Raumes selbst, as because the possibilities of being in general have not been in principle transparent, and an interpretation of them in terms of ontological concepts has been lacking. If we are to understand the ontological problem of space, it is of decisive importance that the question of being must be liberated from the narrowness of those concepts of being which merely chance to be available, and which are for the most part rather rough, and the problematic of the being of space with regard to that phenomenon itself and various phenomenal spatialities must be turned in such a direction as to clarify the possibilities of being in general. In the phenomenon of space, the primary ontological character of the being of entities within the world is not to be found, either as unique or as one among others. Still less does space constitute the phenomenon of the world. Unless we go back to the world, space cannot be conceived. Space becomes accessible only if the environment is deprived of its worldhood. And spatiality is not discoverable at all except on the basis of the world. Indeed, space is still one of the things that is constitutive for the world, just as Dasein's own spatiality is essential to its basic state of being in the world. Chapter 4. Being in the world as being with and being oneself, the they. Our analysis of the worldhood of the world has constantly been bringing the whole phenomenon of being in the world into view, although its constitutive items have not all stood out with the same phenomenal distinctness as the phenomenon of the world itself. We have interpreted the world ontologically by going through what is ready to hand within the world. And this interpretation has been put first because Dasein, in its everydayness, with regard to which Dasein remains a constant theme for study, not only is in a world, but comports itself towards that world with one predominant kind of being. Proximally, and for the most part, Dasein is fascinated with its world. Dasein is thus absorbed in the world. The kind of being which it thus possesses, and in general the being in which underlies it, are essential in determining the character of a phenomenon which we are now about to study. We shall approach this phenomenon by asking who it is that Dasein is in its everydayness. All the structures of being which belong to Dasein, together with the phenomenon which provides the answer to this question of the who, are ways of its being. To characterize these ontologically is to do so existentially. We must therefore pose the question correctly and outline the procedure for bringing into view a broader phenomenal domain of Dasein's everydayness. By directing our researches towards the phenomenon which is to provide us with an answer to the question of the who, we shall be led to certain structures of Dasein which are equiprimordial with being in the world. Being with and Dasein with. Mit-Sein und Mit-Dasein. In this kind of being is grounded the mode of everyday being one's self, Selbstsein. The explication of this mode will enable us to see what we may call the subject of everydayness, the they. Our chapter on the who of the average Dasein will thus be divided up as follows. 1. An approach to the existential question of the who of Dasein. 2. The Dasein with of others, and everyday being with. 3. Everyday being oneself, and the they. Section 25. An approach to the existential question of the who of Dasein. The answer to the question of who Dasein is one that was seemingly given in Section 9, where we indicated formally the basic characteristics of Dasein. Dasein is an entity which is, in each case, I, myself. Its being is, in each case, mine. This definition indicates an ontologically constitutive state, but it does no more than indicate it. At the same time, this tells us, ontically, though in a rough and ready fashion, that in each case an I, not others, is this entity. The question of the who answers itself in terms of the I itself, the subject, the self. The who is what maintains itself as something identical throughout changes in its experiences and ways of behavior, and which relates itself to this changing multiplicity in so doing. Ontologically, we understand it as something which is in each case already constantly present at hand, both in and for a closed realm, and which lies at the basis, in a very special sense, as the subjectum. As something self-same in manifold otherness, it has the character of the self. Even if one rejects the soul substance and the thinghood of consciousness, or denies that a person is an object, ontologically one is still positing something whose being retains the meaning of present at hand, whether it does so explicitly or not. Substantiality is the ontological clue for determining which entity is to provide the answer to the question of the who. Dasein is tacitly conceived in advance as something present at hand. This meaning of being is always implicated in any case where the being of Dasein has been left indefinite. Yet presence at hand is the kind of being which belongs to entities whose character is not that of Dasein. The assertion that it is I who in each case Dasein is ontically obvious, but this must not mislead us into supposing that the root for an ontological interpretation of what is given in this way has thus been unmistakably prescribed. Indeed, it remains questionable whether even the mere ontical content of the above assertion does proper justice to the stock of phenomena belonging to everyday Dasein. It could be that the who of everyday Dasein just is not the I myself. If in arriving at ontico-ontological assertions one is to exhibit the phenomena in terms of the kind of being which the entities themselves possesses, and if this way of exhibiting them is to retain its priority over even the most usual and obvious of answers, and over whatever ways of formulating problems may have been derived from those answers, then the phenomenological interpretation of Dasein must be defended against a perversion of our problematic when we come to the question we are about to formulate. But is it not contrary to the rules of all sound method to approach a problematic without sticking to what is given as evident in the area of our theme? And what is more indubitable than the givenness of the I? And does not this givenness tell us that, if we aim to work this out primordially, we must disregard everything else that is given, not only a world that is, eine seienden Welt, but even the being of other I's. The kind of giving we have here is the mere formal, reflective awareness of the I. And perhaps what it gives is indeed evident. This insight even affords access to a phenomenological problematic in its own right, which has in principle the signification of providing a framework as a formal phenomenology of consciousness. In this context of an existential analytic of factical Dasein, the question arises whether giving the I, in the way we have mentioned, discloses Dasein in its everydayness, if it discloses Dasein at all. Is it then obvious a priori that access to Dasein must be gained only by mere reflective awareness of the I of actions? What if this kind of giving itself, on the part of Dasein, should lead our existential analytic astray, and do so indeed in a manner grounded in the being of Dasein itself? Perhaps when Dasein addresses itself in the way which is closest to itself, it always says, I am this entity, and in the long run says this loudest when it is not this entity. Dasein is in each case mine, and this is its constitution. But what if this should be the very reason why, proximally and for the most part, Dasein is not itself? What if the aforementioned approach, starting with the givenness of the I to Dasein itself, and with a rather patent self-interpretation of Dasein, should lead the existential analytic, as it were, into a pitfall? If that which is accessible by mere giving can be determined, there is presumably an ontological horizon for determining it. But what if this horizon should remain in principle undetermined? It may well be that it is always ontically correct to say of this entity that I am it. Yet the ontological analytic which makes use of such assertions must make certain reservations about them in principle. The word I is to be understood only in the sense of a non-committal formal indicator, indicating something which may perhaps reveal itself as its opposite, in some particular phenomenal context of being. In that case, the not I is by no means tantamount to an entity which essentially lacks I-hood, Ichheit, but is rather a definite kind of being, which the I itself possesses, such as having lost itself, Selbstverlorenheit, Yet even the positive interpretation of Dasein, which we have so far given, already forbids us to start with the formal givenness of the I if our purpose is to answer the question of the who in a way which is phenomenally adequate. In clarifying being in the world, we have shown that a bare subject without a world never is proximally, nor is it ever given. And so in the end an isolated I without others is just as far from being proximally given. If, however, the others already are there with us, mit da sind, in being in the world, and if this is ascertained phenomenally, even this should not mislead us into supposing that the ontological structure of what is thus given is obvious, requiring no investigation. Our task is to make visible phenomenally the species to which this Dasein, with, in closest everydayness belongs, and to interpret it in a way which is ontologically appropriate. Just as the ontical obviousness of the being in itself of entities within the world misleads us into the conviction that the meaning of this being is obvious ontologically, and makes us overlook the phenomenon of the world, the ontical obviousness of the fact that Dasein is in each case mine also hides the possibility that the ontological problematic which belongs to it has been led astray. Proximally, the who of Dasein is not only a problem ontologically, even ontically it remains concealed. But does this mean that there are no clues whatever for answering the question of the who by way of existential analysis? Certainly not. Of the ways in which we formally indicated the constitution of Dasein's being in sections 9 and 12 above, the one we have been discussing does not, of course, function so well as such a clue as does the one according to which Dasein's essence is grounded in its existence. If the I is an essential characteristic of Dasein, then it is one which must be interpreted existentially. In that case, the who is to be answered only by exhibiting phenomenally a definite kind of being which Dasein possesses. If in each case Dasein is itself only in existing, then the constancy of the self, no less than the possibility of its failure to stand by itself, requires that we formulate the question existentially and ontologically as the sole appropriate way of access to its problematic. But if the self is conceived only as a way of being of this entity, this seems tantamount to volatilizing the real core of Dasein. Any apprehensiveness, however, which one may have about this gets its nourishment from the perverse assumption that the entity in question has at bottom the kind of being which belongs to something present at hand, even if one is far from attributing to it the solidity of an occurrent corporeal thing. Yet man's substance is not spirit as a synthesis of soul and body. It is rather existence. Section 26. The Dasein with of others and everyday being with. The answer to the question of the who of everyday Dasein is to be obtained by analyzing that kind of being in which Dasein maintains itself proximally and for the most part. Our investigation takes its orientation from being in the world, that basic state of Dasein by which every mode of its being gets co-determined. If we are correct in saying that by the foregoing explication of the world the remaining structural items of being in the world have become visible, then this must also have prepared us, in a way, for answering the question of the who. In our description of that environment which is closest to us, the work world of the craftsman, for example, the outcome was that along with the equipment to be found when one is at work, in Arbeit, those others for whom the work, Werk, is destined are encountered too. If this is ready to hand, then there lies in the kind of being which belongs to it, that is, in its involvement, an essential assignment or reference to possible wearers, for instance, for whom it should be cut to the figure. Similarly, when material is put to use, we encounter its producer or supplier as one who serves well or badly. When, for example, we walk along the edge of a field but outside it, the field shows itself as belonging to such and such a person, and decently kept up by him. The book we have used was bought at so-and-so's shop, and given by such and such a person, and so forth. The boat anchored at the shore is assigned in its being in itself to an acquaintance who undertakes voyages with it. But even if it is a boat which is strange to us, it still is indicative of others. The others, who are thus encountered in a ready-to-hand, environmental context of equipment, are not somehow added on in thought to some thing which is proximally just present at hand. Such things are encountered from out of the world in which they are ready to hand for others, a world which is always mine too in advance. In our previous analysis, the range of what is encountered within the world was, in the first instance, narrowed down to equipment ready to hand, or nature present at hand, and thus to entities with a character other than that of Dasein. This restriction was necessary not only for the purpose of simplifying our explication, but above all because the kind of being which belongs to the Dasein of others, as we encounter it within the world, differs from readiness to hand and presence at hand. Thus Dasein's world frees entities which not only are quite distinct from equipment and things, but which also, in accordance with their kind of being as Dasein themselves, are in the world in which they are at the same time encountered within the world, and are in it by way of being in the world. These entities are neither present at hand nor ready to hand. On the contrary, they are like the very Dasein which frees them, in that they are there too and there with it. So if one should want to identify the world in general with entities within the world, one would have to say that Dasein too is world. Thus, in characterizing the encountering of others, one is again still oriented by that Dasein, which is in each case one's own. But even in this characterization does one not start by marking out and isolating the I, so that one must then seek some way of getting over to the others from this isolated subject. To avoid this misunderstanding, we must notice in what sense we are talking about the others. By others, we do not mean everyone else but me, those over against whom the I stands out. They are rather those from whom, for the most part, one does not distinguish oneself, those among whom one is too. This being there too, auch Dasein, with them, does not have the ontological character of a being present at hand, along with them within a world. This with is something of the character of Dasein. The two means a sameness of being as circumspectively concernful being in the world. With and to are to be understood existentially, not categorially. By reason of this with-like, mithaften, being in the world is always the one that I share with others. The world of Dasein is a with world, Mitwelt. Being in is being with others. Their being in themselves within the world is Dasein with, Mitdasein. When others are encountered, it is not the case that one's own subject is proximally present at hand, and that the rest of the subjects, which are likewise occurrents, get discriminated beforehand and then apprehended. Nor are they encountered by a primary act of looking at oneself in such a way that the opposite pole of a distinction first gets ascertained. They are encountered from out of the world in which concernfully circumspective Dasein essentially dwells. Theoretically concocted explanations of the being present at hand of others urge themselves upon us all too easily. But over against such explanations we must hold fast to the phenomenal facts of the case which we have pointed out, namely that others are encountered environmentally. This elemental worldly kind of encountering, which belongs to Dasein and is closest to it, goes so far that even one's own Dasein becomes something that it can itself proximally come across only when it looks away from experiences and the centre of its actions, or does not as yet see them at all. Dasein finds itself proximally in what it does, uses, expects, avoids, in those things environmentally ready to hand, with which it is proximally concerned. And even when Dasein explicitly addresses itself as I here, this locative, personal designation must be understood in terms of Dasein's existential spatiality. In interpreting this, We have already intimated that this I here does not mean a certain privileged point, that of an I thing, but is to be understood as being in terms of the yonder of the world that is ready to hand, the yonder which is the dwelling place of Dasein as concern. W. von Humboldt has alluded to certain languages which express the I by here, the thou by there, the he by yonder, thus rendering the personal pronouns by locative adverbs, to put it grammatically. It is controversial whether indeed the primordial signification of locative expressions is adverbial or pronominal, but this dispute loses its basis if one notes that locative adverbs have a relationship to the I qua Dasein. The here and the there and the yonder are primarily not mere ways of designating the location of entities present at hand within the world, at positions in space. They are rather characteristics of Dasein's primordial spatiality. These supposedly locative adverbs are Dasein designations. They have a signification which is primarily existential, not categorial. But they're not pronouns either. Their signification is prior to the differentiation of locative adverbs and personal pronouns. These expressions have a Dasein signification which is authentically spatial, and which serves as evidence that when we interpret Dasein, without any theoretical distortions, we can see it immediately as being alongside the world with which it concerns itself, and as being alongside it spatially, that is to say, as dissevering and giving directionality. In the here, the Dasein, which is absorbed in its world, speaks not towards itself, but away from itself, towards the yonder of something circumspectively ready to hand, yet it still has itself in view in its existential spatiality. Dasein understands itself proximally, and for the most part in terms of its world, and the Dasein with of others is often encountered in terms of what is ready to hand within the world. But even if others become themes for study, as it were, in their own Dasein, they are not encountered as person things present at hand. We meet them at work, that is, primarily in their being in the world. Even if we see the other just standing around, he's never apprehended as a human thing present at hand, but his standing around is an existential mode of being, an unconcerned, uncircumspective tarrying alongside everything and nothing, verweilen bei allem und keinem. The other is encountered in his Dasein with in the world. The expression Dasein, however, shows plainly that, in the first instance, this entity is unrelated to others, and that of course it can still be with others afterwards. Yet one must not fail to notice that we use the term Dasein with to designate that being for which the others, who are, die seienden anderen, are freed within the world. This Dasein with of the others is disclosed within the world for a Dasein, and so too for those who are Daseins with us, die Mitdaseienden, only because Dasein in itself is essentially being with. The phenomenological assertion that Dasein is essentially being with has an existential ontological meaning. It does not seek to establish ontically that factically I'm not present at hand alone, and that others of my kind occur. If this were what is meant by the proposition that Dasein's being in the world is essentially constituted by being with, then being with would not be an existential attribute which Dasein, of its own accord, has coming to it from its own kind of being. It would rather be something which turns up in every case by reason of the occurrence of others. Being with is an existential characteristic of Dasein, even when, factically, no other is present at hand or perceived. Even Dasein's being alone is being with in the world. The other can be missing only in and for a being with. Being alone is a deficient mode of being with. Its very possibility is the proof of this. On the other hand, a factical being alone is not obviated by the occurrence of a second example of a human being beside me, or by 10 such examples. Even if these and more are present at hand, Dasein can still be alone. So being with, and the facticity of being with one another, are not based on the occurrence together of several subjects. Yet being alone, among many, does not mean that with regard to their being, they are merely present at hand, there alongside us. Even in our being among them, they are there with us. Their Dasein with is encountered in a mode in which they are indifferent and alien. Being missing and being away, thus fehlen und fortsein, are modes of Dasein with, and are possible only because Dasein as being with lets the Dasein of others be encountered in its world. Being with is in every case a characteristic of one's own Dasein. Dasein with characterizes the Dasein of others to the extent that it is freed by its world for a being with. Only so far as one's own Dasein has the essential structure of being with is it Dasein with as encounterable for others. If Dasein with remains existentially constitutive for being in the world, then, like our circumspective dealings with the ready-to-hand within the world, which, by way of anticipation, we have called concern, it must be interpreted in terms of the phenomenon of care, for as care, the being of Dasein in general is to be defined. Compare Chapter 6 of this division. Concern is a character of being, which being with cannot have as its own, even though being with, like concern, is a being towards entities encountered within the world. But those entities towards which Dasein as being with comports itself do not have the kind of being which belongs to equipment ready to hand. They are themselves Dasein. These entities are not objects of concern, but rather of solicitude. Even concern with food and clothing and the nursing of the sick body are forms of solicitude. But we understand the expression solicitude in a way which corresponds to our use of concern as a term for an existentiale. For example, welfare work, Fürsorge, as a factical social arrangement, is grounded in Dasein's state of being as being with. Its factical urgency gets its motivation in that Dasein maintains itself proximally, and for the most part, in the deficient modes of solicitude. Being for, against, or without one another, passing one another by, not mattering to one another, these are possible ways of solicitude, and it is precisely these last-named deficient and indifferent modes that characterize everyday, average being with one another. These modes of being show again the characteristics of inconspicuousness and obviousness which belong just as much to the everyday Dasein with of others within the world as to the readiness to hand of the equipment with which one is daily concerned. These indifferent modes of being with one another may easily mislead ontological interpretation into interpreting this kind of being, in the first instance, as the mere being present at hand of several subjects. It seems as if only negligible variations of the same kind of being lie before us. Yet ontologically there is an essential distinction between the indifferent way in which things at random occur together and the way in which entities who are with one another do not matter to one another. With regard to its positive modes, solicitude has two extreme possibilities. It can, as it were, take away care from the other and put itself in his position in concern. It can leap in for him. This kind of solicitude takes over for the other that with which he is to concern himself. The other is thus thrown out of his own position. He steps back so that afterwards, when the matter has been attended to, he can either take it over as something finished and at his disposal, or disburden himself of it completely. In such solicitude, the other can become one who is dominated and dependent, even if this domination is a tacit one and remains hidden from him. This kind of solicitude, which leaps in and takes away care, is to a large extent determinative for being with one another, and pertains for the most part to our concern with the ready-to-hand. In contrast to this, there is also the possibility of a kind of solicitude which does not so much leap in for the other as leap ahead of him, ihm vorausspringt, in his existentielle potentiality for being. not in order to take away his care, but rather to give it back to him authentically, as such for the first time. This kind of solicitude pertains essentially to authentic care, that is, to the existence of the other, not to a what with which he is concerned. It helps the other to become transparent to himself in his care, and to become free for it. Solicitude proves to be a state of Dasein's being, one which, in accordance with its different possibilities, is bound up with its being towards the world of its concern, and likewise with its authentic being towards itself. Being with one another is based proximally and often exclusively upon what is a matter of common concern in such being. A being with one another which arises, entspringt, from one's doing the same thing as someone else, not only keeps for the most part within the outer limits, but enters the mode of distance and reserve. The being with one another of those who are hired for the same affair often thrives only on mistrust. On the other hand, when they devote themselves to the same affair in common, their doing so is determined by the manner in which their Dasein, each in its own way, has been taken hold of. They thus become authentically bound together, and this makes possible the right kind of objectivity, die rechte Sachlichkeit, which frees the other in his freedom for himself. Everyday being with one another maintains itself between the two extremes of positive solicitude, that which leaps in and dominates, and that which leaps forth and liberates, vorspringend, befreienden. It brings numerous mixed forms to maturity. To describe these and classify them would take us beyond the limits of this investigation. Just as circumspection belongs to concern as a way of discovering what is ready to hand, solicitude is guided by considerateness and forbearance. Like solicitude, these can range through their respective deficient and indifferent modes up to the point of inconsiderateness, or the perfunctoriness for which indifference leads the way. The world not only frees the ready-to-hand as entities encountered within the world, it also frees Dasein, and the others in there Dasein with. But Dasein's ownmost meaning of being is such that this entity, which has been freed environmentally, is being in the same world in which, as encounterable for others, it is there with them. We have interpreted worldhood as that referential totality which constitutes significance. In being familiar with this significance and previously understanding it, Dasein lets what is ready to hand be encountered as discovered in its involvement. In Dasein's being, the context of references or assignments which significance implies is tied up with Dasein's ownmost being, a being which essentially can have no involvement, but which is rather that being for the sake of which Dasein itself is as it is. According to the analysis which we have now completed, being with others belongs to the being of Dasein, which is an issue for Dasein in its very being. Thus, as being with, Dasein is essentially for the sake of others. This must be understood as an existential statement as to its essence. Even if the particular factical Dasein does not turn to others and supposes that it has no need of them or manages to get along without them, it is in the way of being with. In being with, as the existential for the sake of others, these have already been disclosed in their Dasein. With their being with, their disclosedness has been constituted beforehand. Accordingly, this disclosedness also goes to make up significance, that is to say, worldhood. And significance, as worldhood, is tied up with the existential for the sake of which, since the worldhood of that world in which every Dasein essentially is already, is thus constituted, it accordingly lets us encounter what is environmentally ready to hand as something with which we are circumspectively concerned, and it does so in such a way that together with it we encounter the Dasein with of others. The structure of the world's worldhood is such that others are not proximally present at hand as free-floating subjects, along with other things, but show themselves in the world in their special environmental being, and do so in terms of what is ready to hand in that world. Being with is such that the disclosedness of the Dasein with of others belongs to it. This means that because Dasein's being is being with, its understanding of being already implies the understanding of others. This understanding, like any understanding, is not an acquaintance derived from knowledge about them, but a primordially existential kind of being, which, more than anything else, makes such knowledge and acquaintance possible. Knowing oneself, sich kennen, is grounded in being with, which understands primordially. It operates proximally in accordance with the kind of being which is closest to us, being in the world as being with. And it does so by an acquaintance with that which Dasein, along with the others, comes across in its environmental circumspection and concerns itself with, an acquaintance in which Dasein understands. Solicitous concern is understood in terms of what we are concerned with, and along with our understanding of it. Thus, in concern for solicitude, the other is proximally disclosed. But because solicitude dwells proximally and for the most part in the deficient, or at least the indifferent modes, in the indifference of passing one another by, the kind of knowing oneself which is essential and closest demands that one become acquainted with oneself. And when indeed one's knowing oneself gets lost in such ways as aloofness, hiding oneself away, or putting on a disguise, being with one another must follow special routes of its own in order to come close to others, or even to see through them, hinter sie zu kommen. But just as opening oneself up, sich offenbaren, or closing oneself off, is grounded in one's having being with one another, as one's kind of being at the time, and indeed is nothing else but this, even the explicit disclosure of the other in solicitude, grows only out of one's primarily being with him in each case. Such a disclosure of the other, which is indeed thematic, but not in the manner of theoretical psychology, easily becomes the phenomenon which proximally comes to view when one considers the theoretical problematic of understanding the psychical life of others, Fremdenseelenlebens. In this phenomenally proximal manner, it thus presents a way of being with one another understandingly, but at the same time it gets taken as that which, primordially and in the beginning, constitutes being towards others and makes it possible at all. This phenomenon, which is none too happily designated as empathy, Einfühlung, is then supposed, as it were, to provide the first ontological bridge from one's own subject, which is given proximally as alone, to the other subject, which is proximally quite closed off. Of course, being towards others is ontologically different from being towards things which are present at hand. The entity which is other has itself the same kind of being as Dasein. In being with and towards others, there is thus a relationship of being, Seinsverhältnis from Dasein to Dasein. But it might be said that this relationship is already constitutive for one's own Dasein, which, in its own right, has an understanding of being, and which thus relates itself towards Dasein. The relationship of being which one has towards others would then become a projection of one's own being towards oneself into something else. The other would be a duplicate of the self. But while these deliberations seem obvious enough, it is easy to see that they have little ground to stand on. The presupposition which this argument demands, that Dasein's being towards an other is its being towards itself, fails to hold. As long as the legitimacy of this presupposition has not turned out to be evident, one may still be puzzled as to how Dasein's relationship to itself is thus to be disclosed to the other as other. Not only is being towards others an autonomous, irreducible relationship of being, this relationship as being with is one which, with Dasein's being, already is. Of course it is indisputable that a lively mutual acquaintanceship on the basis of being with often depends upon how far one's own Dasein has understood itself at the time. But this means that it depends only upon how far one's essential being with others has made itself transparent, and has not disguised itself. And that is possible only if Dasein, as being in the world, already is with others. Empathy does not first constitute being with. Only on the basis of being with does empathy become possible. It gets its motivation from the unsociability of the dominant modes of being with. But the fact that empathy is not a primordial existential phenomenon, any more than is knowing in general, does not mean that there is nothing problematical about it. The special hermeneutic of empathy will have to show how being with one another and Dasein's knowing of itself are led astray and obstructed by the various possibilities of being which Dasein itself possesses, so that a genuine understanding gets suppressed, and Dasein takes refuge in substitutes. The possibility of understanding the stranger correctly presupposes such a hermeneutic as its positive existential condition. Our analysis has shown that being with is an existential constituent of being in the world. Dasein with has proved to be a kind of being, which entities encountered within the world have as their own. So far as Dasein is at all, it has being with one another as its kind of being. This cannot be conceived as a summative result of the occurrence of several subjects. Even to come across a number of subjects, eine Anzahl von Subjekten, becomes possible only if the others who are concerned proximally in their Dasein with are treated merely as numerals, Nummer. Such a number of subjects gets discovered only by a definite being with and towards one another. This inconsiderate being with rechnet with the others without seriously counting on them, auf sie zählt, or without even wanting to have anything to do with them. One's own Dasein, like the Dasein with of others, is encountered proximally, and for the most part in terms of the with world with which we are environmentally concerned. When Dasein is absorbed into the world of its concern, that is, at the same time, in its being with towards others, it is not itself. Who is it, then, who has taken over being as everyday being with one another? Section 27. Everyday being one's self and the they. The ontologically relevant result of our analysis of being with is the insight that the subject character of one's own Dasein and that of others is to be defined existentially, that is, in terms of certain ways in which one may be. In that with which we concern ourselves environmentally, the others are encountered as what they are. They are what they do. Sie sind das, was sie betreiben. In one's concern with what one has taken hold of, whether with, for, or against the others, there is constant care as to the way one differs from them, whether that difference is merely one that is to be evened out, whether one's own Dasein has lagged behind the others and wants to catch up in relation to them, or whether one's Dasein has already some priority over them and sets out to keep them suppressed. The care about this distance between them is disturbing to being with one another, though this disturbance is one that is hidden from it. If we may express this existentially, such being with one another has the character of distantiality, Abständigkeit. The more inconspicuous this kind of being is to everyday Dasein itself, all the more stubbornly and primordially does it work itself out. But this distantiality which belongs to being with is such that Dasein, as everyday being with one another, stands in subjection, Botmäßigkeit, to others. It itself is not. Its being has been taken away by the others. Dasein's everyday possibilities of being are for the others to dispose of as they please. These others, moreover, are not definite others. On the contrary, any other can represent them. What is decisive is just that inconspicuous domination by others, which has already been taken over unawares from Dasein as being with. One belongs to the others oneself and enhances their power. The others, whom one thus designates in order to cover up the fact of one's belonging to them essentially oneself, are those who proximally and for the most part are there in everyday being with one another. The who is not this one, not that one, not oneself, man selbst, not some people, einige, and not the sum of them all. The who is the neuter, the they. das Man. We have shown earlier how in the environment which lies closest to us, the public environment already is ready to hand, and is also a matter of concern, mitbesorgt. In utilizing public means of transport and in making use of information services, such as the newspaper, every other is like the next. This being with one another dissolves one's own Dasein completely into the kind of being of the others. In such a way indeed that the others, as distinguishable and explicit, vanish more and more. In this inconspicuousness and unascertainability, the real dictatorship of the they is unfolded. We take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as they, man, take pleasure. We read, see, and judge about literature and art as they see and judge. Likewise, we shrink back from the great mass as they shrink back. We find shocking what they find shocking. The they, which is nothing definite and which all are, though not as the sum, prescribes the kind of being of everydayness. The they has its own ways in which to be. That tendency of being with, which we have called distantiality, is grounded in the fact that being with one another concerns itself as such with averageness, which is an existential characteristic of the they. The they, in its being, essentially makes an issue of this. Thus the they maintains itself factically in the averageness of that which belongs to it, of that which it regards as valid and that which it does not, and of that to which it grants success and that to which it denies it. In this averageness with which it prescribes what can and may be ventured, it keeps watch over everything exceptional that thrusts itself to the fore. Every kind of priority gets noiselessly suppressed. Overnight, everything that is primordial gets glossed over as something that has long been well known. Everything gained by a struggle becomes just something to be manipulated. Every secret loses its force. This care of averageness reveals in turn an essential tendency of Dasein, which we call the leveling down, Einebnung, of all possibilities of being. Distantiality, averageness, and leveling down, as ways of being for the they, constitute what we know as publicness, the Öffentlichkeit. Publicness proximally controls every way in which the world and Dasein get interpreted, and it is always right, not because there is some distinctive and primary relationship of being, in which it is related to things, or because it avails itself of some transparency on the part of Dasein which it has explicitly appropriated, but because it is insensitive to every difference of level and of genuineness, and thus never gets to the heart of the matter, auf die Sachen. By publicness everything gets obscured, and what has thus been covered up gets passed off as something familiar and accessible to everyone. The they is there alongside everywhere, ist überall dabei, but in such a manner that it has always stolen away whenever Dasein presses for a decision. Yet because the they presents every judgment and decision as its own, it deprives the particular Dasein of its answerability. The they can, as it were, manage to have them constantly invoking it. It can be answerable for everything, most easily because it is not someone who needs to vouch for anything. It was always the they who did it, and yet it can be said that it has been no one. In Dasein's everydayness, the agency through which most things come about is one of which we must say that it was no one. Thus, the particular Dasein in its everydayness is disburdened by the they. Not only that, by thus disburdening it of its being, the they accommodates Dasein, kommt dem Dasein entgegen, if Dasein has any tendency to take things easily and make them easy. And because the they constantly accommodates the particular Dasein by disburdening it of its being, the they retains and enhances its stubborn dominion. Everyone is the other, and no one is himself. The they, which supplies the answer to the question of the who of everyday Dasein, is the nobody to whom every Dasein has already surrendered itself in being among one another. untereinander-sein. In these characters of being which we have exhibited, everyday being among one another, distantiality, averageness, levelling down, publicness, the disburdening of one's being, and accommodation, lies that constancy of Dasein which is closest to us. This constancy pertains not to the enduring being present at hand of something, but rather to Dasein's kind of being as being with. Neither the self of one's own Dasein nor the self of the other has as yet found itself or lost itself, as long as it is seiend in the modes we have mentioned. In these modes one's way of being is that of inauthenticity and failure to stand by oneself. To be in this way signifies no lessening of Dasein's facticity, just as the they as the nobody is by no means nothing at all. On the contrary, in this kind of being, Dasein is an ens realissimum, the most real being, if by reality we understand a being with the character of Dasein. Of course, the they is as little present at hand as Dasein itself. The more openly the they behaves, the harder it is to grasp, and the slyer it is, but the less is it nothing at all. If we see it ontico-ontologically with an unprejudiced eye, it reveals itself as the realist subject of everydayness. And even if it is not accessible like a stone that is present at hand, this is not in the least decisive as to its kind of being. One may neither decree prematurely that this they is really nothing, nor profess the opinion that one can interpret this phenomenon ontologically by somehow explaining it as what results from taking the being present at hand together of several subjects and then fitting them together. On the contrary, in working out concepts of being, one must direct one's course by these phenomena, which cannot be pushed aside. Furthermore, the they is not something like a universal subject, which a plurality of subjects have hovering above them. One can come to take it this way only if the being of such subjects is understood as having a character other than that of Dasein, and if these are regarded as cases of a genus of occurrence, cases which are factually present at hand. With this approach, the only possibility ontologically is that everything which is not a case of this sort is to be understood in the sense of genus and species. The they is not the genus to which the individual Dasein belongs, nor can we come across it in such entities as an abiding characteristic. That even the traditional logic fails us when confronted with these phenomena is not surprising, if we bear in mind that it has its foundation in an ontology of the present at hand, an ontology which moreover is still a rough one. So no matter in how many ways this logic may be improved and expanded, it cannot in principle be made any more flexible. Such reforms of logic, oriented towards the humane sciences, only increase the ontological confusion. The they is an existentiale, an existential thing, and as a primordial phenomenon, it belongs to Dasein's positive constitution. It itself has in turn various possibilities of becoming concrete as something characteristic of Dasein, seiner daseinsmäßigen Konkretion. The extent to which its dominion becomes compelling and explicit may change in the course of history. The self of everyday Dasein is the they-self, which we distinguish from the authentic self, that is, from the self which has been taken hold of in its own way, eigens ergriffenen. As they-self, the particular Dasein has been dispersed into the they, and must first find itself. This dispersal characterizes the subject of that kind of being which we know as concernful absorption in the world we encounter as closest to us. If Dasein is familiar with itself as they-self, this means at the same time that the they itself prescribes that way of interpreting the world and being in the world which lies closest. Dasein is for the sake of the they in an everyday manner, and the they itself articulates the referential context of significance. When entities are encountered, Dasein's world frees them for a totality of involvements with which the they is familiar, and within the limits which have been established with the they's averageness. Proximally, factical Dasein is in the with world, which is discovered in an average way. Proximally, it is not I, in the sense of my own self, that am, but rather the others, whose way is that of the they. In terms of the they, and as the they, I am given proximally to myself, mir selbst. Proximally, Dasein is they, and for the most part it remains so. If Dasein discovers the world in its own way, eigens, and brings it close, if it discloses to itself its own authentic being, then this discovery of the world and this disclosure of Dasein are always accomplished as a clearing away of concealments and obscurities, as a breaking up of the disguises with which Dasein bars its own way. With this interpretation of being with and being oneself, in the they, the question of the who of the everydayness of being with one another is answered. These considerations have at the same time brought us a concrete understanding of the basic constitution of Dasein. Being in the world, in its everydayness and its averageness, has become visible. From the kind of being which belongs to the they, the kind which is closest, everyday Dasein draws its pre-ontological way of interpreting its being. In the first instance, ontological interpretation follows the tendency to interpret it this way. It understands Dasein in terms of the world, and comes across it as an entity within the world. But that is not all. Even that meaning of being, on the basis of which these subject entities, diese seienden Subjekte, get understood, is one which that ontology of Dasein which is closest to us lets itself present in terms of the world. But because the phenomenon of the world itself gets passed over in this absorption in the world, its place gets taken, tritt an seine Stelle, by what is present at hand within the world, namely things. The being of those entities which are there with us gets conceived as presence at hand. Thus, by exhibiting the positive phenomenon of the closest everyday being in the world, we have made it possible to get an insight into the reason why an ontological interpretation of this state of being has been missing. This very state of being, in its everyday kind of being, is what proximally misses itself, and covers itself up. If the being of everyday being with one another is already different in principle from pure presence at hand, in spite of the fact that it is seemingly close to it ontologically, still less can the being of the authentic self be conceived as presence at hand. Authentic being oneself does not rest upon an exceptional condition of the subject, a condition that has been detached from the they. It is rather an existentielle modification of the they as an essential existentiale, an existential thing. But in that case there is ontologically a gap separating the self-sameness of the authentically existing self from the identity of that I, which maintains itself throughout its manifold experiences. Chapter 5. Being in as such. Section 28. The task of a thematic analysis of being in. In the preparatory stage of the existential analytic of Dasein, we have for our leading theme this entity's basic state, being in the world. Our first aim is to bring into relief phenomenally the unitary primordial structure of Dasein's being, in terms of which its possibilities and the ways for it to be are ontologically determined. Up till now, our phenomenal characterization of being in the world has been directed towards the world, as a structural item of being in the world, and has attempted to provide an answer to the question about the who of this entity in its everydayness. But even in first marking out the tasks of a preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein, we have already provided an advance orientation as to being in as such, and have illustrated it in the concrete mode of knowing the world. The fact that we foresaw this structural item, which carries so much weight, arose from our aim of setting the analysis of single items, from the outset, within the frame of a steady preliminary view of the structural whole. and of guarding against any disruption or fragmentation of the unitary phenomenon. Now, keeping in mind what has been achieved in the concrete analysis of the world and the who, we must turn our interpretation back to the phenomenon of being in. By considering this more penetratingly, however, we shall not only get a new and surer phenomenological view of the structural totality of being in the world, but shall also pave the way to grasping the primordial being of Dasein itself, namely care. But what more is there to point out in being in the world beyond the essential relations of being alongside the world? Concern, being with, solicitude, and being oneself, who? If need be, there still remains the possibility of broadening out the analysis by characterizing comparatively the variations of concern and its circumspection, of solicitude and the considerateness which goes with it. There is also the possibility of contrasting Dasein with entities whose character is not that of Dasein by a more precise explication of the being of all possible entities within the world. Without question, there are unfinished tasks still lying in this field. What we have hitherto set forth needs to be rounded out in many ways, by working out fully the existential a priori of philosophical anthropology and taking a look at it. But this is not the aim of our investigation. Its aim is one of fundamental ontology. Consequently, if we inquire about being in as our theme, we cannot indeed consent to nullify the primordial character of this phenomenon by deriving it from others, that is to say, by an inappropriate analysis, in the sense of a dissolving or breaking up. But the fact that something primordial is underivable does not rule out the possibility that a multiplicity of characteristics of being may be constitutive for it. If these show themselves, then existentially they are equiprimordial. The phenomenon of the equiprimordiality of constitutive items has often been disregarded in ontology, because of a methodologically unrestrained tendency to derive everything and anything from some simple primal ground. In which direction must we look if we are to characterize being in, as such, phenomenally? We get the answer to this question by recalling what we were charged with keeping phenomenologically in view when we called attention to this phenomenon. Being in is distinct from the present-at-hand insidedness of something present at hand in something else that is present at hand. Being in is not a characteristic that is effected, or even just elicited, in a present-at-hand subject by the world's being present at hand. Being in is rather an essential kind of being of this entity itself. But in that case, what else is presented with this phenomenon than the commercium, which is present at hand between a subject present at hand and an object present at hand? Such an interpretation would come closer to the phenomenal content if we were to say that Dasein is the being of this between. Yet to take our orientation from this between would still be misleading, for with such an orientation we would also be covertly assuming the entities between which this between, as such, is, and we would be doing so in a way which is ontologically vague. The between is already conceived as the result of the convenientia, coming together, of two things that are present at hand. But to assume these beforehand always splits the phenomenon asunder, and there is no prospect of putting it together again from the fragments. Not only do we lack the cement, even the schema in accordance with which this joining together is to be accomplished has been split asunder, or never as yet unveiled. What is decisive for ontology is to prevent the splitting of the phenomenon, in other words, to hold its positive phenomenal content secure. To say that for this we need far-reaching and detailed study is simply to express the fact that something which was ontically self-evident, in the traditional way of treating the problem of knowledge, has often been ontologically disguised to the point where it has been lost sight of altogether. The entity which is essentially constituted by being in the world is itself in every case its there. According to the familiar signification of the word, the there points to a here and a yonder. There, here, of an I here, is always understood in relation to a yonder, ready to hand, in the sense of a being towards this yonder, a being which is disseverant, directional and concernful. Dasein's existential spatiality, which thus determines its location, is itself grounded in being in the world. The yonder belongs definitely to something encountered within the world. Here and yonder are possible only in a there. That is to say, only if there is an entity which has made a disclosure of spatiality as the being of the there. This entity carries in its ownmost being the character of not being closed off. In the expression there, we have in view this essential disclosedness. By reason of this disclosedness, this entity, Dasein, together with the being there of the world, is there for itself. When we talk in an ontically figurative way of the lumen naturale in man, we have in mind nothing other than the existential ontological structure of this entity, that it is in such a way as to be its there. To say that it is illuminated, erleuchtet, means that as being in the world it is cleared, gelichtet, in itself, not through any other entity, but in such a way that it is itself, the clearing. Only for an entity which is existentially cleared in this way does that which is present at hand become accessible, in the light or hidden in the dark. By its very nature, Dasein brings its there along with it. If it lacks its there, it is not factically the entity which is essentially Dasein. Indeed, it is not this entity at all. Dasein is its disclosedness. We are to set forth the constitution of this being. But insofar as the essence of this entity is existence, the existential proposition, Dasein is its disclosedness, means at the same time that the being, which is an issue for this entity and its very being, is to be its there. In addition to characterizing the primary constitution of the being of disclosedness, we will require, in conformity with the course of the analysis, an interpretation of the kind of being in which this entity is its there in an everyday manner. This chapter, in which we shall undertake the explication of being in as such, that is to say, of the being of the there, breaks up into two parts. A, the existential constitution of the there, B, the everyday being of the there, and the falling of Dasein. In understanding and state of mind, we shall see the two constitutive ways of being the there, and these are equiprimordial. If these are to be analyzed, some phenomenal confirmation is necessary. In both cases, this will be attained by interpreting some concrete mode which is important for the subsequent problematic. State of mind and understanding are characterized equiprimordially by discourse. Under A, the existential constitution of the there, we shall accordingly treat being there as state of mind, fear as a mode of state of mind, being there as understanding, understanding and interpretation, assertion as a derivative mode of interpretation, being there, discourse, and language. The analysis of the characteristics of the being there is an existential one. This means that the characteristics are not properties of something present at hand, but essentially existential ways to be. We must therefore set forth their kind of being in everydayness. Under B, the everyday being of the there and the falling of Dasein, we shall analyze idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity as existential modes of the everyday being of the there. We shall analyze them as corresponding respectively to the constitutive phenomenon of discourse, the sight which lies in understanding, and the interpretation, or explaining, Deutung, which belongs to understanding. In these phenomenal modes, a basic kind of being of the there will become visible, a kind of being which we interpret as falling, and this falling shows a movement, Bewegtheit, which is existentially its own. A. The existential constitution of the there. Section 29. Being there as state of mind. What we indicate ontologically by the term state of mind is ontically the most familiar and everyday sort of thing. Our mood, our being attuned. Prior to all psychology of moods, a field which, in any case, still lies fallow, it is necessary to see this phenomenon as a fundamental existentiale, and to outline its structure. Both the undisturbed equanimity and the inhibited ill humour of our everyday concern, the way we slip over from one to the other, or slip off into bad moods, are by no means nothing ontologically, even if these phenomena are left unheeded as supposedly the most indifferent and fleeting in Dasein. The fact that moods can deteriorate, verdorben werden, and change over means simply that in every case Dasein always has some mood, gestimmt ist. The pallid, evenly balanced lack of mood, Ungestimmtheit, which is often persistent and which is not to be mistaken for a bad mood, is far from nothing at all. Rather, it is in this that Dasein becomes satiated with itself. Being has become manifest as a burden. Why that should be, one does not know. And Dasein cannot know anything of the sort because the possibilities of disclosure, which belong to cognition, reach far too short a way compared with the primordial disclosure belonging to moods, in which Dasein is brought before its being as there. Furthermore, a mood of elation can alleviate the manifest burden of being. That such a mood is possible also discloses the burdensome character of Dasein, even while it alleviates the burden. A mood makes manifest how one is and how one is faring, wie einem ist und wird. In this how one is, having a mood brings being to its there. In having a mood, Dasein is always disclosed mood-wise as that entity to which it has been delivered over in its being. And in this way it has been delivered over to the being which, in existing, it has to be. To be disclosed does not mean to be known as this sort of thing, and even in the most indifferent and inoffensive everydayness, the being of Dasein can burst forth as a naked that it is and has to be, als nacktes, das es ist und zu sein hat. The pure that it is shows itself, but the whence and the whither remain in darkness. The fact that it is just as everyday a matter for Dasein not to give in, nachgibt, to such moods, in other words, not to follow up, nachgeht, their disclosure, and allow itself to be brought before that which is disclosed, is no evidence against the phenomenal facts of the case, in which the being of the there is disclosed mood-wise in its that it is. It is rather evidence for it. In an ontico-existentiel sense, Dasein for the most part evades the being which is disclosed in the mood. In an ontologico-existential sense, this means that even that to which such a mood pays no attention, Dasein is unveiled in its being delivered over to the there. In the evasion itself, the there is something disclosed. This characteristic of Dasein's being, this that it is veiled in its whence and whither, yet disclosed in itself all the more unveiledly. We call it the thrownness of this entity into its there. Indeed, it is thrown in such a way that as being in the world, it is the there. The expression thrownness is meant to suggest the facticity of its being delivered over. The that it is and has to be which is disclosed in Dasein's state of mind is not the same that it is, which expresses ontologico-categorially the factuality belonging to presence at hand. This factuality becomes accessible only if we ascertain it by looking at it. The that it is, which is disclosed in Dasein's state of mind, must rather be conceived as an existential attribute of the entity, which has being in the world as its way of being. Facticity is not the factuality of the factum brutum, brute fact, of something present at hand, but a characteristic of Dasein's being, one which has been taken up into existence, even if proximally it has been thrust aside. The that it is of facticity never becomes something that we can come across by beholding it. An entity of the character of Dasein is its there in such a way that, whether explicitly or not, it finds itself, sich befindet, in its thrownness. In a state of mind, Dasein is always brought before itself, and has always found itself, not in the sense of coming across itself, by perceiving itself, but in the sense of finding itself in the mood that it has. As an entity which has been delivered over to its being, it remains also delivered over to the fact that it must always have found itself, but found itself in a way of finding which arises not so much from a direct seeking, as rather from a fleeing. The way in which the mood discloses is not one in which we look at thrownness, but one in which we turn towards or turn away, An- und Abkehr. For the most part, the mood does not turn towards the burdensome character of Dasein which is manifest in it, and least of all does it do so in the mood of elation when this burden has been alleviated. It is always by way of a state of mind that this turning away is what it is. Phenomenally, we would wholly fail to recognize both what mood discloses and how it discloses, if that which is disclosed were to be compared with what Dasein is acquainted with, knows, and believes at the same time when it has such a mood. Even if Dasein is assured in its belief about its whither, or if, in rational enlightenment, it supposes itself to know about its whence, all this counts for nothing as against the phenomenal facts of the case, for the mood brings Dasein before the that it is of its there, which, as such, stares it in the face with the inexorability of an enigma. From the existential ontological point of view, there is not the slightest justification for minimizing what is evident in states of mind by measuring it against the apodictic certainty of a theoretical cognition of something which is purely present at hand. However, the phenomena are no less falsified when they are banished to the sanctuary of the irrational. When irrationalism, as the counterplay of rationalism, talks about the things to which rationalism is blind, it does so only with a squint. Factically, Dasein can, should, and must, through knowledge and will, become master of its moods. In certain possible ways of existing, this may signify a priority of volition and cognition. Only we must not be misled by this into denying that ontologically mood is a primordial kind of being for Dasein, in which Dasein is disclosed to itself prior to all cognition and volition, and beyond their range of disclosure. And furthermore, when we master a mood, we do so by way of a countermood. We're never free of moods. Ontologically, we thus obtain, as the first essential characteristic of states of mind, that they disclose Dasein in its thrownness, and, proximally and for the most part, in the manner of an evasive turning away. From what has been said, we can see already that a state of mind is very remote from anything like coming across a psychical condition by the kind of apprehending which first turns round and then back. Indeed, it is so far from this that only because the there has already been disclosed in a state of mind can immanent reflection come across experiences at all. The bare mood discloses the there more primordially, but correspondingly it closes it off more stubbornly than any not perceiving. This is shown by bad moods. In these, Dasein becomes blind to itself. The environment with which it is concerned veils itself. The circumspection of concern gets led astray. States of mind are so far from being reflected upon that precisely what they do is to assail Dasein in its unreflecting devotion to the world with which it is concerned and on which it expends itself. A mood assails us. It comes neither from outside nor from inside, but arises out of being in the world as a way of such being, but with the negative distinction between state of mind and the reflective apprehending of something within. We have thus reached a positive insight into their character as disclosure. The mood has already disclosed, in every case, being in the world as a whole. and makes it possible first of all to direct oneself towards something. Having a mood is not related to the psychical in the first instance, and is not itself an inner condition which then reaches forth in an enigmatical way and puts its mark on things and persons. It is in this that the second essential characteristic of states of mind shows itself. We have seen that the world, Dasein with, and existence are equiprimordially disclosed, and state of mind is a basic existential species of their disclosedness, because this disclosedness itself is essentially being in the world. Besides these two essential characteristics of states of mind, which have been explained, the disclosing of thrownness and the current disclosing of being in the world as a whole, we have to notice a third, which contributes above all towards a more penetrating understanding of the worldhood of the world. As we have said earlier, the world, which has already been disclosed beforehand, permits what is within the world to be encountered. This prior disclosedness of the world belongs to being in, and is partly constituted by one's state of mind. Letting something be encountered is primarily circumspective. It is not just sensing something or staring at it. It implies circumspective concern, and has the character of becoming affected in some way, Betroffenwerdens. We can see this more precisely from the standpoint of state of mind. But to be affected by the unserviceable, resistant, or threatening character, Bedrohlichkeit, of that which is ready to hand, becomes ontologically possible only insofar as being in, as such, has been determined existentially beforehand in such a manner that what it encounters within the world can matter to it in this way. The fact that this sort of thing can matter to it is grounded in one's state of mind. And as a state of mind, it has already disclosed the world, as something by which it can be threatened, for instance. Only something which is in the state of mind of fearing, or fearlessness, can discover that what is environmentally ready to hand is threatening. Dasein's openness to the world is constituted existentially by the attunement of a state of mind. And only because the senses, die Sinne, belong ontologically to an entity whose kind of being is being in the world with a state of mind, can they be touched by anything or have a sense for, Sinn haben für, something in such a way that what touches them shows itself in an affect. Under the strongest pressure and resistance, nothing like an affect would come about, and the resistance itself would remain essentially undiscovered if, being in the world, with its state of mind, had not already submitted itself, sich schon angewiesen, to having entities within the world matter to it in a way which its moods have outlined in advance. Existentially, a state of mind implies a disclosive submission to the world, out of which we can encounter something that matters to us. Indeed, from the ontological point of view, we must, as a general principle, leave the primary discovery of the world to bare mood. Pure beholding, even if it were to penetrate the innermost core of the being of something present at hand, could never discover anything like that which is threatening. The fact that, even though states of mind are primarily disclosive, every day circumspection goes wrong and to a large extent succumbs to delusion because of them, is a meon, non-being, when measured against the idea of knowing the world absolutely. But if we make evaluations which are so unjustified ontologically, we shall completely fail to recognize the existentially positive character of the capacity for delusion. It is precisely when we see the world unsteadily and fitfully in accordance with our moods that the ready-to-hand shows itself in its specific worldhood, which is never the same from day to day. By looking at the world theoretically, we have already dimmed it down to the uniformity of what is purely present at hand. Though admittedly this uniformity comprises a new abundance of things which can be discovered by simply characterizing them. Yet even the purest theoria, theory, has not left all moods behind it. Even when we look theoretically at what is just present at hand, it does not show itself purely as it looks unless this theoria, theory, lets it come towards us in a tranquil tarrying alongside, in rastone and diagoge, ease and way of life, comfort and recreation. Any cognitive determining has its existential ontological constitution in the state of mind of being in the world. But pointing this out is not to be confused with attempting to surrender science ontically to feeling. The different modes of state of mind, and the ways in which they are interconnected in their foundations, cannot be interpreted within the problematic of the present investigation. The phenomena have long been well known ontically under the terms affects and feelings, and have always been under consideration in philosophy. It is not an accident that the earliest systematic interpretation of affects that has come down to us is not treated in the framework of psychology. Aristotle investigates the pathé, affects, in the second book of his Rhetoric. Contrary to the traditional orientation, according to which rhetoric is conceived as the kind of thing we learn in school, this work of Aristotle must be taken as the first systematic hermeneutic of the everydayness of being with one another. Publicness, as the kind of being which belongs to the they, not only has in general its own way of having a mood, but needs moods and makes them for itself. It is into such a mood and out of such a mood that the orator speaks. He must understand the possibilities of moods in order to rouse them and guide them aright. How the interpretation of the affects was carried further in the Stoa, and how it was handed down to modern times through patristic and scholastic theology, is well known. What has escaped notice is that the basic ontological interpretation of the affective life in general has been able to make scarcely one forward step worthy of mention since Aristotle. On the contrary, affects and feelings come under the theme of psychical phenomena, functioning as a third class of these, usually along with ideation, Vorstellen, and volition. They sink to the level of accompanying phenomena. It has been one of the merits of phenomenological research that it has again brought these phenomena more unrestrictedly into our sight. Not only that, Scheler, accepting the challenges of Augustine and Pascal, has guided the problematic to a consideration of how acts which represent and acts which take an interest are interconnected in their foundations. But even here the existential ontological foundations of the phenomenon of the act in general are admittedly still obscure. A state of mind not only discloses Dasein in its thrownness and its submission to that world which is already disclosed with its own being, it is itself the existential kind of being in which Dasein constantly surrenders itself to the world and lets the world matter to it in such a way that somehow Dasein evades its very self. The existential constitution of such evasion will become clear in the phenomenon of falling. A state of mind is a basic existential way in which Dasein is its there. It not only characterizes Dasein ontologically, but, because of what it discloses, it is at the same time methodologically significant, in principle, for the existential analytic. Like any ontological interpretation whatsoever, this analytic can only, so to speak, listen in to some previously disclosed entity as regards its being. And it will attach itself to Dasein's distinctive and most far-reaching possibilities of disclosure in order to get information about this entity from these. Phenomenological interpretation must make it possible for Dasein itself to disclose things primordially. It must, as it were, let Dasein interpret itself. Such interpretation takes part in this disclosure only in order to raise, to a conceptual level, the phenomenal content of what has been disclosed, and to do so existentially. Later we shall provide an interpretation of anxiety as such a basic state of mind of Dasein, and as one which is significant from the existential ontological standpoint. With this in view, we shall now illustrate the phenomenon of state of mind even more concretely in its determinate mode of fear. 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 Section 30. Fear as a mode of state of mind. There are 3 points of view from which the phenomenon of fear may be considered. We shall analyze 1. That in the face of which we fear, 2. Fearing, and 3. That about which we fear. These possible ways of looking at fear are not accidental. They belong together. With them, the general structure of states of mind comes to the fore. We shall complete our analysis by alluding to the possible ways in which fear may be modified. Each of these pertains to different items in the structure of fear. That in the face of which we fear, the fearsome, is in every case something which we encounter within the world, and which we may have either readiness to hand, presence at hand, or Dasein with, as its kind of being. We're not going to make an ontical report on those entities which can often and for the most part be fearsome. We are to define the fearsome phenomenally in its fearsomeness. What do we encounter in fearing that belongs to the fearsome as such? That in the face of which we fear can be characterized as threatening. Here several points must be considered. 1. What we encounter has detrimentality as its kind of involvement. It shows itself within a context of involvements. 2. The target of this detrimentality is a definite range of what can be affected by it. Thus the detrimentality is itself made definite and comes from a definite region. 3. The region itself is well known as such, and so is that which is coming from it. But that which is coming from it has something queer about it. 4. That which is detrimental as something that threatens us is not yet within striking distance, in beherrschbare Nähe, but it is coming close. In such a drawing close, the detrimentality radiates out, and therein lies its threatening character. 5. This drawing close is within what is close by. Indeed, something may be detrimental in the highest degree and may even be coming constantly closer. But if it is still far off, its fearsomeness remains veiled. If, however, that which is detrimental draws close and is close by, then it is threatening. It can reach us, and yet it may not. As it draws close, this it can, and yet in the end it may not, becomes aggravated. We say it is fearsome. 6. This implies that what is detrimental as coming close, close by, carries with it the patent possibility that it may stay away and pass us by. But instead of lessening or extinguishing our fearing, this enhances it. In fearing as such, what we have thus characterized as threatening is freed and allowed to matter to us. We do not first ascertain a future evil, malum futurum, and then fear it. Neither does fearing first take note of what is drawing close. It discovers it beforehand in its fearsomeness, and in fearing, fear can then look at the fearsome explicitly, and make it clear to itself. Circumspection sees the fearsome because it has fear as its state of mind. Fearing as a slumbering possibility of being in the world in a state of mind, we call this possibility fearfulness, Furchtsamkeit, has already disclosed the world, in that out of it something like the fearsome may come close. The potentiality for coming close is itself freed by the essential existential spatiality of being in the world. That which fear fears about is that very entity which is afraid, Dasein. Only an entity for which in its being this very being is an issue can be afraid. Fearing discloses this entity as endangered and abandoned to itself. Fear always reveals Dasein in the being of its there, even if it does so in varying degrees of explicitness. If we fear about our house and our home, this cannot be cited as an instance contrary to the above definition of what we fear about. For as being in the world, Dasein is in every case concernful being alongside. Proximally, and for the most part, Dasein is in terms of what it is concerned with. When this is endangered, being alongside is threatened. Fear discloses Dasein predominantly in a privative way. It bewilders us and makes us lose our heads. Fear closes off our endangered being in, and yet at the same time lets us see it, so that when the fear has subsided, Dasein must first find its way about again. Whether privatively or positively, fearing about something, as being afraid in the face of something, always discloses equiprimordially entities within the world and being in. The former is threatening, and the latter is threatened. Fear is a mode of state of mind. One can also fear about others, and we then speak of fearing for them, fürchten für sie. This fearing for the other does not take away his fear. Such a possibility has been ruled out already because the other, for whom we fear, need not fear at all on his part. It is precisely when the other is not afraid and charges recklessly at what is threatening him that we fear most for him. Fearing for is a way of having a co-state of mind with others, but not necessarily of being afraid with or even a fearing with one another. One can fear about without being afraid. Yet when viewed more strictly, fearing about is being afraid for oneself. Here what one is apprehensive about is one's being with the other, who might be torn away from one. That which is fearsome is not aimed directly at him who fears with someone else. Fearing about knows that in a certain way it is unaffected, and yet it is co-affected insofar as the Dasein with, for which it fears, is affected. Fearing about is therefore not a weaker form of being afraid. Here the issue is one of existential modes, not of degrees of feeling tones. Fearing about does not lose its specific genuineness, even if it is not really afraid. There can be variations in the constitutive items of the full phenomenon of fear. Accordingly, different possibilities of being emerge in fearing. Bringing close, close by, belongs to the structure of the threatening as encounterable. If something threatening breaks in suddenly upon concernful being in the world, something threatening in its not right away but any moment, fear becomes alarm, erschrecken. So in what is threatening we must distinguish between the closest way in which it brings itself close, and the manner in which this bringing close gets encountered, its suddenness. That in the face of which we are alarmed is proximally something well known and familiar. But if, on the other hand, that which threatens has the character of something altogether unfamiliar, then fear becomes dread, Grauen. And where that which threatens is laden with dread and is at the same time encountered with the suddenness of the alarming, then fear becomes terror, Entsetzen. There are further variations of fear which we know as timidity, shyness, misgiving, becoming startled. All modifications of fear, as possibilities of having a state of mind, point to the fact that Dasein, as being in the world, is fearful, furchtsam. This fearfulness is not to be understood in an ontical sense as some factical, individualized disposition, but as an existential possibility of the essential state of mind of Dasein in general, though of course it is not the only one.